So, I've played 3 of the 4 games that were showcased at the Xbox Dev Direct this year, and I've got a lot to say about all of them. But I want to start with the one I played first, South of Midnight. Developed by Compulsion Games, the story follows a teenager named Hazel, whose home is washed away in a hurricane with her mother still inside. She must explore the Deep South to get her mother back, and interacts with both her distant family and mythological creatures, friend and foe, along the way. I find myself having a hard time talking about this game because there's a lot I love about it, but I don't know if I fully love the execution of the ideas this game presents. What I will tell you is that I devoured the entire game in a single weekend. So, let's start off with the things that I loved about this game. I deeply appreciate that this game addresses the folklore of the Deep South. It's a fairly niche set of stories that I hadn't heard of, having grown up in Virginia just south of the Mason-Dixon line. The only things we have are the Bunny Man and the Richmond Vampire, and even that didn't exist until supposedly, 2001. While I was researching this, I got a little teary-eyed because I had to come to terms with the fact that these stories, passed down through generations, are starting to lose their hold in the world. When researching Two Toed Tom, I found that there's a festival specifically for him in Esto, Florida, and for a time in 2019 it almost didn't happen. It seems the festival is back again as of 2025 though, and the organizers seem over the moon that South of Midnight mentioned him. I'd say if you're in Florida, maybe drop by. It's on September 13th. There's also a bit of reference to hoodoo spiritual practices, which I find is an interesting choice, but also makes a ton of sense in a story about the Deep South. Hoodoo took root in America in the antebellum era of the South. Think plantations and slavery. It's a spiritual practice that's a mixture of traditional African religions, such as Bakongo, and the practice of medicinal botany. It's a practice that's faced all kinds of adversities, the same kinds one would expect that slaves would go through. For example, in the 1700s, Code Noir was implemented in Louisiana, which made the practice of any religion other than Catholicism illegal. The themes of slavery also weave through the tapestry of South of Midnight. Hazel finds her weaving power, and the weaver before her is a woman leading a family through caves and forests to safety, hiding them away from slavers in the process. Very much modeled after Harriet Tubman's Underground Railroad. From the very beginning, once we find Grandma Bunny in her huge plantation manor with hurricane-proof windows, you know where you are and the history you'll find in Prospero. I guess the point I'm making is that it is so important for media like South of Midnight to exist because of the way that these parts of history are left in darkness. And I think it's genius to bring them forward in a way that feels accessible to anyone. Unfortunately, I am not the person to ask about its accuracy, and to be honest, I've had a really hard time finding anyone who's really broken it down to talk about it. If you folks know anyone who's done a breakdown of the story and how it lines up with history, please shout them out in the comments. It's not necessarily that I don't want to do the research, but researching themes that primarily affect African Americans have become increasingly difficult, and I also do not have that lived experience. But on to lighter things, I think this story is a great coming-of-age story as well. In the beginning, Hazel is, of course, frustrated, a teenager kicking against the unfairness of society, and feels neglected as her father has passed away and her mother is constantly busy helping disadvantaged people in her small town of Prospero. But, of course, she has to grow up fast as her home and her mother are swept away from her. And throughout her journey, she becomes kinder, stronger, and more aware of the world around her. The world of South of Midnight is just a slice of home for me. From small broken towns to hulking mountain passes, there is nowhere you can go in South of Midnight that you'd find yourself hating how the game looks. The game also solves the problem of yellow paint with blue paint. In South of Midnight's lore, this is to ward off hags, witches that lived amongst slaves and brought harm to them in the night, stealing their literal breath to live. But I find this marking to be a bit more natural amongst the aesthetics of the world while still catching your eye enough to let you know which rock to grab or land on next. There's also some yellow highlights for throwable and breakable objects, but the majority of interactables emit a pretty periwinkle blue shade, so you know where to go. And that said, due to those highlights, it makes exploring those levels really easy and accessible. I know a lot of people were kind of turned off by the stop-motion-esque animation, and I think what it is that the effect was just a little too fast to really register as stop-motion. I thought at first the game was lagging out on me, but after running through the world a bit, it finally occurred to me that it was a stylistic thing. You can turn this effect off, but I think had it just been a tad slower, the effect would have been better telegraphed. But I really love the idea of it, and it makes sense with the characters looking like they're sort of made of clay. I also really like the way all the UI elements look, fitting in well with the storybook elements that demarcate each chapter of the story. The way that the concept of weaving is well woven through the world is also really great. Those bobbin lace aesthetics pepper through everything. How Hazel moves through the world, indicators of where stigma may lurk, and parts of patterns that become the way that Hazel heals the deep-rooted hurt that bubbles to the surface everywhere she goes. There's stories to be told in fiber arts, and being the daughter of a woman who has a love for both history and fabric craft, I loved the intersection of these concepts as part of the wider story and aesthetics. The voice acting, sound design, and music were all seriously on point. I loved Catfish's voice the most. The way he enunciated certain words made my heart sing in unexpected ways.
Well then, I can teach you the rest. And a train weaver ought to be able to rescue her mama easy. I can even help you find her. When you get me down, of course.
The music does just as much as Catfish's narration to tell the story of what's happening.
I'll break my bones! I'll raise my skin! Brick burn to dust and rage!
And the choral stings as Hazel uses her powers make navigation a lovely experience. But there's also the quiet moments too. What sticks out most to me is the swamp you find Catfish in. The toads, the birds, the quiet rustle of leaves. It felt like being back home when I was a child and would visit the swamp that inexplicably stood at the back of our suburb. Always too scared to wade in and explore further, but I love the sounds of nature that existed amongst the concrete and cars. Most of my complaints about South of Midnight do come from how combat is approached, but I do want to talk about the things I liked about it before I get into that. I appreciated that the tools we pick up are multi-purpose, both used to help us navigate through the world and to defeat Haints. I also love the way that you can find an arena by this shimmering barrier. It's very much giving the shimmer in Annihilation. And the Haints are fucking scary looking. I don't know why, but every time I finished an arena my first time through, I would cry as I saw the angry, twisted vines fade away and flowers begin to bloom around Hazel's feet. Maybe it was seeing the immediate effect of cleansing an area of stigma, seeing that something I did enacted change on the world for the better. One step at a time, one bit at a time, but measurable. It felt good. Unfortunately, I think that South of Midnight suffers from a lot of repetition of the way that story moments and combat are executed, and that's problematic in a story-based game. So, let me explain what I mean by repetition. We'll start with story moments. There's basically 6 ways that story gets told in this game. Chapter narration, cutscenes, breaking stigma, finding an object from Hazel's home, finding letters or lantern motifs that provide lore, or ad hoc moments as you're running in-game. This does sound like a lot of ways that the story gets told, so you may be wondering how that gets repetitive. And I think the biggest problem is that the majority of these ways are telling and not showing. And while I understand that Compulsion most likely would have had a budget to stick to, I'll point out that at least 2 of those methods were already utilizing animation and voice acting, so I guess I just don't quite understand the approach of having ghosts tell you the thing that they're going through, rather than just showing the thing they're going through without extra narration or explaining into the camera what's going on. The chapter narration doesn't provide any new information either. It basically explains what happened in the previous chapter, and then what Hazel's going to be doing in the next chapter, which isn't really needed because the previous chapter will have an objective that points us to the next chapter's purpose. I don't necessarily find the letters to be a problem. These have existed in some form or another in all story-based games and make plenty of sense to exist in this one. The cutscenes and ad hoc moments are the best. They feel dynamic, provide fresh information, and like they directly involve Hazel, rather than being a thing that Hazel is watching happen. And just to put a finer point on this, I realize that some of this actually may be a stylistic choice. Folklore is often passed down through word of mouth or through books, which we're writing books and telling stories in all of these scenes that we get here, but I just don't think the execution is all the way there. It just feels incredibly repetitious, which is unfortunate because I think if the story were told in different ways and perspectives, I think it would have actually helped to really cement the flavor of each of these different types of stories, considering they all come from different parts of the South as well. The theme of repetition also applies to combat, and if you've been following any other commentary about South of Midnight, this is the most common complaint. Every arena is the same, bar the boss fights. To a certain point, they stop feeling like a necessary railroad to prevent the player from going through the game too fast, and more just like an obligatory thing that needs to exist because combat was promised in the game. It becomes repetitive quickly, mostly because you get most of the tools of the game that you need fairly early on for navigation's sake, with your little buddy Crouton being the exception to this, coming in much later than your other tools. Unfortunately, even the boss fights suffer from repetition. There's second and even third phases, but every phase essentially functions the same, with no additional mechanics being introduced. They also share a common mechanic of a weak spot that you specifically have to hit to do real damage. This isn't bad on its own, and the weak spot is in different places for each boss, but combined with the repetition of, well, everything else, it starts to feel less engaging overall. You go through the motions of combat to get to story that is not told in a particularly dynamic way. It's a real shame because, as I said at the top of this video, I did really enjoy the game and got through it incredibly quickly. And while I found Hazel's story quite compelling, at a certain point I really had to work hard to engage with the story. The best reprieve from this was when we met Honey and his mama. The environments felt fresh and engaging. There were moments where you had to be quick on your feet to dodge Honey's mom's mud balls from knocking you off of logs that you were climbing. It was a really great part of the game that felt different enough to the point that I didn't really mind the repetitive arenas that much. But I just don't think that there was enough of this kind of thing to really distract from the overly repetitive mechanics. I would have liked bigger arenas with longer fights and more types of hints that would force me to use my tools in different ways as the game escalated, especially as it's understood the player would be unlocking more abilities and skilling up the ways that their abilities work. What I think would have worked better for this game was to take the approach Life is Strange did. Story-based, unique art style, and no combat, but using mechanics to solve puzzles, find clues, and make quick decisions, all while still doing the things to progress the story. To be fair, you can turn off the combat in South of Midnight, but then what else is there to do? This feels more like a stopgap solution rather than something that should exist in a story-driven game. I wouldn't necessarily call it lazy, but it's certainly a choice. And I get it's also an accessibility option, but the thing is, if your game is okay with having no combat at all, I would maybe reassess why the combat was put in there in the first place. All in all, I think South of Midnight does a good job at bringing fresh life to a niche set of folklore that not many people are familiar with. I just wish it had done so in ways that were a bit more considered. There's still a lot to love about this game though, and I'd encourage everyone to give it a roll. And I hope the next title from Compulsion will be just as good, if not better. Hi guys! Just wanted to pop in and say thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. I'd also like to mention that I now have memberships available because my channel has finally been remonetized after many years. So if you would like to support the channel, do a membership tier, even if it's just for 1 month, I would super appreciate it. And yeah, that's about it. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!